All right, good question from Sunday morning. The question has to do with the reference to the predetermined plan of God to have his own son lay down his life on our behalf, and the culpability then of Judas Iscariot. What do we say about Judas if this is God's predetermined plan? Well, Jesus himself said of Judas that it would be better that he had never been born. So clearly, Judas is being held accountable. But it's really not just an issue with Judas. There's more than that at play here. When Paul and Peter especially, in Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4, says God's predetermined plan was for his son to lay down his life on behalf of the people. But then he also said, you guys handed him over in your rebellion. And so Peter was totally comfortable with God's perfect predetermined plan and the culpability of the people who did it. And you say, well, how does that work? Well, let's say it this way. I'm a coach of a basketball team, and I know that the point guard can only dribble with his right hand. And so I tell my defenders, you defend him to that side, to the left side, and we'll shut their whole offense down. Could you say, well, the other team lost, really the point guard's not to blame? I would say, no, the point guard's weaknesses cost them to lose the game. The fact that the other coach knew that about them and exploited that to his own design doesn't mean that that point guard's not responsible for the fact that he didn't do enough dribbling work with his left hand to make him so ineffective on the left side of the offense. Or take another analogy like that. You go to battle and one general knows that the other general has no tanks, or that the pilots for the planes are really inexperienced. And you say, well, that general is going to take advantage of those weaknesses. Does that mean there's no culpability on the other side? Yeah, they should have trained more. They should have been focused more. So that general's knowledge gets played against his opponent, against his enemy. But it's not to say that the enemy then is not responsible at all for the fact that happened. You would say the enemy wasn't prepared. So it is with Judas. It's not to say that Judas didn't have a natural bent for a lot of evil. In fact, we're told by John that Judas was pilfering from the funds for Jesus' ministry. John and the other disciples discovered this after the fact. Like, where'd all the money go? And maybe they checked out Judas's closet and he had a bunch of mink coats. I don't know. But anyway, they figured this out, that Judas had been skimming off the top of the funds. And so there's some greed involved there. And so greed playing in with some other issues with Judas at the end in order to betray Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. I guess Judas is like, well, if this thing's all going to go down poorly, I might as well at least make a buck before this thing ends. And then also I can preserve my own hide, because I'll be on the side of the people with the swords and not on the people with no swords, So the fact that God sent Jesus into the world and Jesus intentionally selects Judas as one of his disciples doesn't remove the fact that Judas was a bad guy. He was a selfish, self-promoter, self-preservationist, even to the extent of using great evil. And so Judas really, in some ways, represents all of us, because all of us have an inclination to do those kinds of things. But Judas actually also represents the worst of the worst in humanity, in that even God's own son, loving people in front of them, doing miracles, healing the blind and the lame, feeding 5,000, doing all these incredible things, and Judas sees all that and sees only dollar signs. And then when it looks like the money's going to run out, Judas is like, I'll turn him over. I don't care. I just want the money. Judas really represents the worst of the worst. So God uses his knowledge of Judas's evil. But the reality is, if Judas hadn't been there to do it, there were plenty of other people who would have done the same thing. And so because of that, Judas really does represent every person. But, there's certainly, at his level of evil, there's certainly plenty of those people floating around. So when Jesus selects him, he knowingly selects a man that will one day betray him. But the character of the man is what made that possible. So I don't think there's any way to remove the culpability from Judas, any more than there's any way to remove any culpability from the religious leaders of Jesus' day that turned him over to the Roman authorities. And Peter even says, you guys turned over the Son of God, the Messiah, to the Roman authorities to kill. And then Peter also says, this was according to God's predetermined plan. So I think both can be in play. God can be completely sovereignly involved in the moving of history, but using both the natural good and the natural evil of humans in the process of working out his will, which prevents the human from saying, I had nothing to do with this, but it also prevents God from saying, well, it didn't work out the way I wanted. And so I think both are there, and the full knowledge of God combined with the plan of God working with the natural bent of humanity is what makes Judas fully culpable and yet still functioning within the plan that God had. So that's a good question. There's a delicate balance there without the over-determining of God to allow humans to function within their image-bearing freedom, while also saying God is still in charge and will work things out as he will. So I think that's the delicate balance there, but I think we can walk it. I think it's possible to walk those two. That's a really good question. I appreciate it. We'll see you guys Sunday morning.
You are my